Hello everyone, today we talk about early modern Scottish pikemen, not Scottish infantry as a whole, right? We will mostly concentrate on the Lowlanders, but of course we're Highland pikemen, etc. And we will see in other videos other types of Scottish infantrymen. We will look at battles. So, the highlights are Flodden and Pikemen. So we will draw some information from there, of course, accounts describing the behavior of Scottish pikemen. You can argue that, albeit European warfare by this point was becoming about pikes, and one can actually debate, like as I could do as a medievalist that studies actually the peak of use of the pike in medieval warfare, contrarily to what is thought, is not at the end of the Middle Ages actually. Is before, at least quantitatively speaking, the early 14th century, where the Scots surely had their own time, but it was a standard weapon. And while this was becoming a standard weapon for infantry anyway, you can make the case that this weapon was sort of traditional for the Scots, right? It was suited to the poor land with little cash or metal to spare, and dependent on an armed peasantry for defense, right? So the pike, whatever distance you that much from the enemy, is of course something you can use with poor armor, right? Because you will not come too close to someone that can offend you with a sword, with a mace, as men-at-arms at the end of the Middle Ages, in fact, were, and in some cases were equipped specifically to at least smash into it would have been very dangerous, but they did so into pikemen at the same time. Scotland fully ranked within the great monarchies of Europe. However, it still was a bit wilder, right, than the average. And the reason being that historically this land didn't have much of a social stratification because of the scarcity of surplus, which meant in turn, and we've seen it in other circumstances, I made videos about 14th century Scottish warfare, for example, and about the army organization, etc., had fewer elite troops, right? What England, for example, had as, by this point, not even a particularly updated country. I'm talking about Renaissance warfare compared to the Continental development, still, surpass the Scots, as we'll see now, in cavalry, definitely, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And of course, there is a shading there. But as we will see, even for the borderers, horsemen, the tendency to dismount, right, to withstand. This was the point, like a greater offensive, a bit like just like the English had done against the French during the 100 Years' War. Many people say that this was somehow more traditional for some reason, some sort of Anglo-Danish permanence, I don't know, in English warfare. There doesn't seem to be any trace of that, right? By that point, the English would fight, in fact, whenever they had the good ratios, also as the other Europeans that would mostly shock cavalry charge, etc. And this is also what had happened against the Scots, so that actually a bit of that mindset of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen that you find during the 100 Years' War derived from the defeats that had been inflicted by the Scots on the English because of this large amount, literally masses of pikemen. As we've seen, poor people, very often without much. This is perhaps an underestimation, but in general, much of a drill, like given that most of them were militia, right? But that, when well lined up by their commanders in a good position with covered flanks by natural obstacles, etc., in terms of sheer primitive brutality and hardness, they could hold the line and repel significant attacks, right? There wasn't much of science behind this, tactically speaking. There was, however, a lot of determination, which is, in terms of moral forces, combining courage and reason by essentially knowing why you're risking your life, but still for the best, right, most functional, rational purpose. And the Scottish armies hadn't been changing throughout the late Middle Ages. Actually, when you look back in time, these solid blocks of spearmen, known also as schiltrons, that didn't have basically anything special in them. The schiltron is not a special tactical formation. It simply means that the solid block of spearmen. That's it. There is no other strange, weird, wargamistic speculation about that. It's just the most plain, basic tactical notion you can think of. Had not, in fact, just met the English on many a medieval battlefield, but had a long history, right, behind them, back possibly to the ancient Picts, who also had formed tight clumps of spearmen in battle. I made a video about Pictish warfare that explains, and tactics specifically, that explains this, highlighting that at that time, especially, it seems that the Picts being, in relative terms, even much more tactically dynamic, right, with a very effective use of cavalry, missile troops, and still these spearmen that are, however, something slightly different from the bulkier and somehow less maneuverable, definitely just for the size, so that was obliging even in the advancements of civilization in that regard, but that was that, so as we were noticing, and comparatively to other people, to less active cavalry warfare, right? At the time of the Picts, it's estimated that the Celts used cavalry more, say, than the Anglo-Saxons did, right? Even though I'm a great proponent for the notion that Anglo-Saxons consistently did fight on horseback. But that's another story. I made, as you know, lots of videos about Anglo-Saxon warfare as well. I'm not going to digress on it now, right? But it was really like, even before a military tradition, a political and social thing. Again, lots of armed peasants that were mostly defending strategically and tactically. Obviously, they were able to somehow pass to counterattack, but for most of the later Middle Ages, cavalry took the initiative in that sense. That had simply survived as such, as a simple but effective mean, right? The most obvious, rational one in those circumstances. Now, in early modern warfare, as you know, we've seen many times, the most important change is the escalatory increase in collective training started by the Swiss as far as infantry was concerned. The reason why this had not happened before during the Middle Ages is that it cost a freaking lot. Also, the nobility mostly detained say a disproportionate amount of power compared to the average commoner. So there weren't the resources nor the political will to train, so costly, by the way, this very large amount of people that, when discharged, could have still remaining this combative force, right? It could attempt a revolution or some kind of that. I made lots of videos about the Swiss, about the French infantry of the Italian wars, for example, that explains you that a bit like why, in fact, the Mountain Germans and the Valois went at war differently. Why they found a common ground politically and in terms of mercenarism. We'll see now how this notions were traveling abroad. How basically all the great powers in Europe were to provide themselves now with an infantry force trained essentially the Swiss or the German way. Now, the reason why they would do so in the Renaissance, always bear it in mind, and will never cease to emphasize this, has nothing but I mean literally nothing to do with any form of improvement of the commoners from a political point of view. These were not commoners' armies. These were proletarian armies, traumatically trained, brutalized, disciplined by the single most powerful and overly aristocratic princely regimes dominating the entire system at this point. There is nothing about the entire progressistic, positivistic delusion that, I don't know, even how could it be born historically into thinking that the Renaissance or the early modern age had anything to do with a sort of increase in relative capacity of the individual from a political point of view. This is something that they began essentially to fantasize in the 18th century in completely different realities, and of course to pretend that things had begun by then. But from a military point of view, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, these people were dangerous, but as you know, we are in the heart of the Ancien regime. The thing would remain locked for centuries. So this was not definitely the case of a sort of increase in power of the commoner, right? Nor of much awareness. I mean, think about Scotland just being, yes, maybe having actually the commoner having more power in relative terms, but in absolute terms still living a miserable life, much more than, say, an average Englishman would. And the nobility, of course, maintaining control on these forces. Now, as far as the Kingdom of Scotland was interested in, as we were saying before, they really wanted to import the most updated infantry tactics to cope with their military threats, namely, the English, as you understand. And this is the reason why historically, like Swiss tactics, that as we'll see, of course, were different than the ones of the previous pikemen that were present out there from quite a while, if not from prehistory actually, were imported for the Flodden campaign by James IV, right? Who essentially replaced spears with imported, quote, Swiss pikes 15 feet long. Now, the interesting aspect of this, what is it? Is it about the length of the pike, right? Before, oh my God, they lacked the technology of having longer pikes. No, this is nothing to do with any form of technology. As a matter of fact, Renaissance fencing, like say pike fencing, say of within the pike shot, was incredibly primitive, unrefined. These guys just like trusted like crazy because they didn't even see what they were hitting or controlling that. And the entire point of this new tactics was having essentially larger bodies of pikemen that thus were ever more effective. The more, say, the larger they were, in the sense, the more compact they could be, and that therefore could just push on this mass impact, right, of essentially from the various ranks with these pikes hitting, and nothing more sophisticated than that, but piling up this force from the front ranks and pushing, right? So the problem of the length, the pike length, was about the fact that the longer, of course, the weapon is, and the less control you have on it. So for smaller units, it was useless to have such long pikes, except, of course, now you had to update the situation because there were other powers out there that could carry out the tactics by having, in fact, larger bodies of troops trained to maintain the cohesion of that formation. Right, so the most difficult thing, the one that actually highlights the military quality, right, even the civilizational development at this point, right, collective training, which is superior to anything warrioristic and individualistic. Make really lots of videos about that, right? So of course, a man-at-arms would have a greater amount of training than this pikeman. He would know perfectly how to handle the pike much better than these guys, but there were too few of that elite troops to make a square, and at that point, with mass of men, but by Renaissance standards, and that sheer number alone, even with lower individual quality, would overwhelm that prior chivalric warfare. Naturally, there was a hybrid in this, as we will see, because the front ranks were, say, tougher, as always, also before Renaissance warfare, like since Xenophon, normally. And this, of course, brought also the nobility to dismount and to fight on foot. We have observed this, we were talking about it the other day in the video about the 30 Years' War. This is something that had started with the Spanish, that flowed accordingly at this point in Italy and in Germany. Think about the Frundsberg who fought at Pavia just in front of his own men, of his Landsknechts. And the Scottish nobility was objectively just already in that order, right, of mind, right? You can't argue that the nobility in Europe had been growing more accustomed to this increasingly, let's say, anti-manned warfare, meaning literally that now artillery could pierce through your finest armor. There were heavy fortifications, but especially political powers were now capable of fielding this larger amount of troops, and so the individualistic, knight had surely still a space in here. This is in part to observe even with the Scottish Highlanders, etc. But it was fading in importance, and of course in these major engagements, I mean, here we're talking about, Flodden, but tens of thousands, Flodden, Pinkie Cleugh, tens of thousands of troops, right? So from both sides, you needed to adjust to that standard, and warfare is always asymmetrical by definition for obvious physical reality. But at the same time, especially the larger the engagements, the more you have to balance the odds, because that asymmetry must be still gapped, as it can't put you, at least puts one of the two that has to cope with that in a condition of inferiority that you have to gap. So James IV is responsible for this in Scotland. This process was, by the way, carried out, as we will see now, by 40 French captains, officers, who would train in this context of the old alliance, the Scottish levies in Continental tactics. Now, this is fascinating because aside from the fact that at Flodden, we know that there were Frenchmen in the Scottish army, but we don't know what they actually did. The French, as we observed before, were not even just among the most proficient infantry tactics military out there that would normally buy the Swiss that they could just send back when they were done, and so not arming this, because basically France lost the Italian wars because the nobility feared to arm those masses of men, but France had, of course, a disproportionate amount of demographic resources, could, if armed, could simply crush even Spain, whatever. But that wasn't done, right? They had the finest cavalry, had the finest artillery, but as far as the infantry was concerned, they bought the Reichsläufer of the Swiss Confederacy. They were, of course, the masters in the initial times, and eventually others copied. The Empire did so, and at Flodden we have this early Scottish training with the pike the Swiss way, because these were already pike. So in this instance, Scots pikemen formed shoulder to shoulder in columns, at least as deep, and often deeper than they were wide. This was the point, essentially creating that, again, sum of force, like on a single front. It could be reduced, but could also put the infantry in a bit more of an aggressive mode, because of course it's easier to follow less troops on the front. That of course exposes your flanks, but these tactics, now we don't have time to digress on Flodden specifically, but have to do with terrain, with troops availability, and lots of other insight. But the point of this infantry, and this is what really the Swiss had brought to the fore, was the attacking capability. I mean, before the Swiss, you do have infantry advancing and taking on the enemy, but always supported by cavalry, because the capacity to maintain cohesion against a cavalry charge in open field was not, and especially considering the relatively scarce availability of infantry masses, and very often still the size of punching capacity of cavalry. In fact, not enough to meet that force. So it was a matter of covering, we've seen in the wars of Scottish independence, the front. The most actually standard tactics continentally was placing the infantry wings on the flanks of cavalry and essentially fighting against the enemy once. Eventually, if you defeated them, closing on the enemy cavalry from the flanks. And at this point, instead, infantry can really travel fast on the battlefield, taking on the enemy, and quite difficultly being broken from the front because of this great amount of layered troops that, again, must be trained with a disproportionate amount of resources compared to before in order to be able to achieve this. So this is interesting because, of course, the Battle of Flodden is a Scottish victory, and it highlights still the British reception of continental insights at this point. You know that the English, like this was, say, Britain, as we were saying before, would remain a bit isolated. The English still went mostly by heavy cavalry, long bowmen, right? They had especially actually a few war horses, a few artillery of their own. They had to import it from places like Flanders. So until the mid-16th century, they were still kind of effective on continental battlefields. After that, basically until the new model army, they lagged behind. Well, the Scots were even more backwards in this regard. They also had longbows still going on, as we'll see, few guns in general. I made a video about the Scottish Army organization, which I showed how actually Scotland had been quick in adopting, of course, firearms, but it's just, again, how much can you afford them, you know? And that's the case. You find brutal Highlanders that still, by the 17th century, fight essentially as medieval warriors without any difference whatsoever at home, but are capable of handling the most technologically advanced arms when they serve abroad. We'll talk briefly about them, because today we do not actually talk about Scottish pikemen in service abroad, right? But still, there is some insight that we can draw from how they were especially armed and how they were serving, generally speaking, abroad, for how this could influence warfare in their homeland. But to make a long story short, it's fascinating how still the French and the Scots, they were not nor particularly advanced in infantry tactics, nor particularly in the case of the Scots, updated in general, would score this success against the English at Flodden, thanks to this Swiss fashion. Bear in mind that not all the peoples were immediately provided with Swiss tactics through contractors, drill masters, etc., had been successful, right? The Habsburgs, for example, had tried that under Maximilian in Flanders. They finally made the Flemish win, I think, their first victory after, I don't know, I think the early 14th century against the French. because of Swiss tactics, but the broader attempt to reform Flanders on the pattern of some sort of centralized force with square pikes, etc., available for the Habsburgs did fail. Right, so of course, throughout early modern warfare, and quite soon, all Europeans would provide themselves with this kind of formations. But remember that there is an important difference between militias, professionals, how many troops you can bring on the field. We were just talking about that in the video about the 30 Years' War. So mercenaries, private companies, were often more successful than militias, as you understand, and this types of armies cost really a lot, right? There isn't much going on beyond Flodden and Pinky Clove, telling you the truth, in terms of major engagements in this period in Scotland, because obviously resources were limited. There was a lot of warfare in general, as you know. Think about the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. We'll talk about that for the end of the period. And slight differences in Scottish armament that, as we've seen, were not positive. Right, at least they were lagging behind at that point, the English and other forces. Right, so this is not a history of clamorous success, but at least at the beginning of the period, Scotland really had her numbers, right, and satisfactory quality in these matters. Right, so we know. At this point, that in defense, the front rank of pikemen crouched so low that they almost knelt, with the pike points of the rear ranks crossing those of the front. So as easy to encounter as angry hedgehog, as it was called by one of the contemporary sources of Flodden. Right, and in attack, they came on in this battle, quote, Allemagne, that is German, fashion, very orderly and with no shouting, right? This was the deal. It's fascinating that even the Spanish conquistadors fighting against, the natives in Chile at some point, they described certain infantries that had either learned from the Westerners or were compacting the mix of kind of those tactics, that they were well drilled and well disciplined like the Germans, right? And the reason why again the Germans are brought up is that they meant the Swiss essentially and the Landsknechts, right? So some of the finest troops, but as you know, here there are also other rising, because the Germans were thought to be sturdy and, as you hear now, silent, like focused on order. There was some national pride revolving around, especially their condition, especially the Landsknechts. Of course, the Swiss too. I made a video about the Landsknechts describing this and why during the 16th century the German infantry was so famed. In any case, it is reasonable to suppose that the Scottish levies at battles like Flodden, though very brave, were less well drilled and disciplined than Swiss or German professionals. And this is kind of obvious. They were militia, right? But as we were saying before, when you learn the essentials and you can perform them good enough, you don't have to be the best one at it. But if you are then motivated, you know what to do, you're well led, and you're also a bit lucky, you can cause a massive bath of blood of whoever is in front of you, which is, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters. So, regarding the organization, so we know earlier that the Scots had been forming pikemen into units of about 500, and this may have remained. However, the tactical columns were much larger. For example, at Pinky Clove, basically 3 huge battles, right? So battle lines, which must have been at least 7,000 strong, given the total, because they were almost basically all pikemen at this point in the army. Are counted, right? At Flodden, Chloe 1547, Flodden 1513. So we have this sort of generational 30 years distance comparison. And perhaps on that occasion, with French advice, those 40 officers divided each battle into about 8 smaller columns, probably to facilitate, maybe to reduce a bit the cohesion, but to facilitate the advance, because again, that was the most important thing. That with very few drill, it was difficult to do as a wall, right? So the more subdivided the columns were, paradoxically, the better you could get the broader punch, because they would advance with less, let's say, with less complications in the internal structure as opposed to a wall. To a wall system. Of course, there normally were this kind of subdivisions, right? But on that occasion, by the way, the Scottish battle lines of pikemen counted something like 5,000 men each. And there was a Venetian diplomatic source referring on the occasion of Flodden of, quote, several hundred arquebuses being sent by the French, if I understand it correctly, which is interesting because the French also didn't make particular use of, at this point, warfare was about pike and shot, right? So as they weren't that good at pike, they weren't even at shot, if not artillery, that, the French one was actually impressive. They had the best park in Europe. But this is fascinating because normally Scottish armies are not really showing, in fact, a lot of shot either, right? So several hundred arquebuses, listen, on an army of tens of thousands of men, it's not that much, right? But if you want to create a screen, a curtain of, say volley fire, like for just wiping a bit the floor of some other Schwerpunkt, some other, because at the end of the day, that's light infantry, right? They don't take on pikemen. Well, that would have been the case, right? So everything helped in this context, and the old alliance made a bit of that too. Scotch forces were based on a militia system, not unlike that of England. That had been the traditional way. The Scots were obliged essentially to equip themselves for war according to rank, according to the traditional subdivision. In theory, every able-bodied freeman was eligible for military service, had the king asked that. Then the gentry, because of their privilege, had to maintain feudal contingents for the army. So something more, let's say, integrated, as you know, because this still at the beginning there was the concept of the lengths of the essentially of a sort of armed system that revolved around the man-at-arm plus other supports, etc. The militias would mostly entail infantry forces, as we noticed. That was the product, and they were eventually array drilled. Normally, as you know, even if there were single companies, you would normally have like the heavy cavalry all in one line, and then the skirmishers just operating all together, etc., not necessarily even following their own leaders during the major engagements. So a pretty standard military organization. There were sheriff's inspections at the biannual weapon shows that in Scotland were attended also thanks to the free drinks that were sometimes provided. This is fascinating because, of course, nobody really wanted to go to these weapon shows. At least it was a big deal. The reason why the monarchy instituted say meetings was to not just to observe whether your troops were up to the task by inspecting them, controlling their armament, etc. But it was also a political testing, like how many of the clansmen would essentially appear for the king, right? And it was a journey, especially for the most faraway places. It cost a substantial amount. So there was an effort to modernize the system to facilitate these gatherings, and that was essentially for making people ready to do so when they were summoned for an actual campaign. The weapons listed as acceptable at weapon shows during the 16th century included spears and pikes, because, as you know, they're not the same thing. They do not produce, as we've seen, the same units. The pike is only a longer spear, but with a spear, in fact, you can't operate in a square, if not like in normal, medieval-like units, right? So those have a purpose, right? And there are troops, as we'll see, in fact, here equipped with halberds as well, the lathe axes and the Yudward staves. The latter, two long, broad-bladed, two-handed axes, similar to the halberd, without its spike, right? Some have hooks. That is also fascinating. They essentially grappled with armor. They could pull it, etc. And of course, everything was very much scarcely standardized in a way, right? At this point, actually, of course, weapons were pretty similar, but some of these people would literally create them on their own. Think about the Lockbeard axe. So they became iconic of Scotland in a way. Those were essentially evolving from those even work tools of the medieval peasantry that were, however, quite good at can opening. Let's put it this way, especially when some enemy knight had impaled his horse on a pike, and after having overthrown from his mount, was just pretty upset on the ground, dazed, whatever, because of the impact, the adrenaline, the actual burden of armor that, yes, they did, they performed athletic feats in it, but still was pretty high, and sometimes contributed to make you stay down. Well, the skewed guys would arrive with these massive weapons and start smashing into the person, creating traumas underneath the armor, and or trying to force the open sides of between the armor joints, let's say, and making pretty heavy damage. Always bear in mind, halberds have nothing to do with stopping cavalry, right? Only pikes are the only weapon you use to stop cavalry. There is no other weapon before the 18th century stops cavalry on a collective level. These weapons and their mass, especially halberds, do cut, right? And of course, the Swiss, for example, with their Vogue, etc., were claiming that they opened literally even the cut through plate armor, this kind of things, which is very complicated to say the least. But it's the blunt, the smashing, at least capacity can create damage, but only when the at least cavalry has stopped. Not necessarily when you have a Norse, the knight, you can cut or break a horse hoof with these weapons, etc. But that's in fact not a normal situation for cavalry, because if they charge into infantry and they don't manage to break through, that's the single most dangerous moment for them. They have to pull out, unless they see, that by pushing a little bit more, they're capable of breaking the enemy. But it's very, very risky, and that's where you take also lots of casualties. And the Scots, again, had somehow specialized in this kind of, again, courageous infantry defense resistance, especially against cavalry, but they used this stuff, of course, copiously against one another. And as you know, even the average lowlander wasn't really, a particularly delicate, and sensitive individual. So they also had some idea of how to cut throats and other stuff. Two-handed swords were also required at weapon shows. They technically were employed both for, as usually, smashing, say the structure, let's say the system that plate armor had developed to the end of the Middle Ages, and or for opening horrendous wounds within the pikemen's ranks, right? Not always so easily or successfully, right? The idea goes that they would simply cut the pikes. It's not technically so simple or feasible, but they were still used like that. Think about the forlorn hope, double-paid units that had to perform not just that task, but also some assault ones, etc. It requires really a great physique, more than all these other weapons that also do not kid, right? So this was mostly like an elite. Missile weapons such as longbows and crossbows were still around this earlier time. Of course, they would normally abandon battlefields by the mid 16th century, but again, in the Celtic fringe, you see them for going on for a longer time. They were objectively effective. Consider that armor, especially among the posterior ranks of the square, that were many, as we've seen more than before, were now generally unarmored, right? So it was easier to inflict horrendous wounds with these weapons. The point, though, is that there were the arquebuses now that brought in much greater amount of jowls that rendered, say, this other missile weapons obsolete. But it was happening very gradually, so that again, until the mid 16th century, it did make sense to still employ that kind of weapon. Handguns, in fact, were to be provided to Scottish infantry. By 1535, landed men were ordered to keep themselves with an Harquebus-a-croc, but at Pikemen, the Scots still had few firearms. In fact, lack of missile power was a major weakness in their armies during the 16th century. This, again, depended on the lesser amount of technology available in quantity in Scotland, because there were simpler, say cheaper, but still effective, somehow equally effective means, especially in a more pressured context, that would do. And consider also the army composition right now. This even larger amount of pikemen, right? That alone are heavy infantry. So doesn't matter how effective firearms are, they're still at this point making light infantry, right? It's only, as we were saying, during the 18th century, that at the beginning of the 18th century, that muskets become the main weapon of heavy infantry, because now the missile is stronger than the pike, right? But at this point, even if you had, say, fewer harquebusiers, you would surely suffer more on the battlefield, because it meant that you would just be not passive, but you couldn't respond, let's say, on equal terms to arquebus fire. So your infantry ranks would have been more depleted than one of the enemy through that factor. But as we've seen, this was not necessarily the decisive factor. In fact, again, light infantry is not by definition a decisive factor. However, it does help, right? So mid-century Scots pikemen mostly wore a simple iron helmet, so an iron pot or skull, a jack, and white doublet and hose, right? The sleeves and thighs of the latter were guarded against sword and other weapon cuts by 4 or 5 rows of brass chain, right? The jack was literally spelled Jakke, right? Or so known as brigandine, because at least there were different types, as you understand, because it could be a flax, essentially a doublet of leather or canvas, possibly, and simply stuffed with rags or tallow, right? Because we're talking about militias again, as we were saying before. Pikemen are not that armored, right? At the beginning of the period, naturally, there's more armor around. If we think about the 15th century as the moment of greater use of metal armor in history per soldier, right? And also in absolute terms, given the technology involved. And some of this stuff, however, could have an inner lining of small metal plates riveted onto the fabric, still in this time, so that only the pattern of rivet heads showed through, but it was much more resistant, as you understand. So the chains, the brass chains we pointed out before, were, say, crudely adequate to the flak cut. They might be sewn into doublet and hose, right? That's how you would go. It was not definitely cut or bulletproof, but it was still the average that unitly was invested in, while other resources were invested. It's like the same concept of, in other stuff, of why armor disappears at this point, because of course it was much more convenient to invest in firepower, so in arquebuses, than creating incredibly costly and inefficient armor as far as especially the weight, so the agility of the soldier was concerned. Is that you could have for one of that guy multiple guns at a point, and so you would simply go with that. Right, it was definitely more convenient. A large kerchief was wound 3 or 4 times round the neck, quote, not for cold but for cutting. So we see, of course, think about the melee between pikemen, and so what you really cared about protecting than that messy hedgehog. And further protection was provided by a round buckler held in the left hand, which could be useful even when grasping the pike, and could still be employed in circumstances that were perhaps not so orthodox. But some of these pikemen would find themselves, like, imagine the square breaks. You still have something you can use as a sort of defense, even if you're escaping through the through the woods somewhere. Like you can't get into ambushes. You can find yourself in any circumstance for which you would use a buckler, right? That can even offer you a minimal protection, even when you're wearing it. Also, you could tie it to your band brace at some point, but mostly was held in the hand because it was really useful in terms of active fencing. As we've seen, the secondary weapons of a Scottish pikeman could be a broadsword, a dagger, for example, the dirk, that is somehow between a dagger and a stillet, depending which evolutionary type we're talking about. Lowlanders of the 16th century commonly wore the blue bonnet, and other usual clothing colors were gray, light blue, normally so that it's white and blue, the colors of Scotland. And generally speaking, pikemen formed something like 70% or more of Scottish armies, at least at Flodden and Pinkie, that are the larger battles of the period. And again, it was becoming somehow in line with the rest of Europe, but Scotland just had that from quite a while. The vulnerability of the Scottish pikemen against the enemy, however, is still fascinating. For example, the longbowmen in the English army shot down badly armored Highlanders at Flodden, interestingly enough, while the Scots nobles that provided the lowland pikemen with a front rank that was, quote, so surely armored that shot of arrows did them no harm, evidently made a different impression. The bill that was, say, pretty characteristic of English army, that was used also by many other countries profusely, but the English seem to have made like the greatest use of it in relative terms, provided more than a match for Scots pikes. Quote, for they shortly disappointed the Scots of the long spears wherein was their greatest trust. They could not resist the bills that lighted so thick and sore upon them. This is fascinating because it highlights what we were saying before also about double-handed swords, etc. That such pole arms were particularly bulky, right? They had a smashing capacity, not just a thrust in one, and it could combine the different action of blunt, thrust, and cut. Right? There are all different. So the most complete ones were not even properly the English bills, but they were used again in that quantity that that pikemen could be a bit, let's say, not intimidated by, but this could still be taken on with. Now, does this have a future, right, for development infantry? No, right? We're talking about still systems in which, for whichever reason, at Flodden here, you have, say, billmen managing to break through pikemen at some point, but that wasn't the way to go, right? The pikes, and if they were so, as we've seen, compact and just operating as they should, were of course superior to this weapons, and this depends also on the degree of armoredness of the opponent, things that we largely don't know, right? We weren't at Flodden realizing the forces, the degrees of armoredness involved, etc. But efforts were being made to persuade the English adopt pike and arquebus, right? That they wouldn't get if not by foreign specialists at the beginning of this period. And so what we see just from an English perspective, it doesn't mean that was particularly successful in absolute terms, right? At some point you could still have, again, billmen succeeding against pikemen, but it was just continental, to a degree connected not with the system, the arms system employed, but just with, again, the actual situation. Consider that the Scots nobility and gentry no longer fought mounted against English cavalry at this point. So from the other side, you had really also a lot of very very good fighters on foot in the front rank of the pikemen. It didn't make sense just to take on the English on horseback most of the time, especially in larger engagements, because as we've seen, the English cavalry both outnumbered and outclassed the Scottish one. A disadvantage of this was that early casualties could deprive the army of its command structure, because this men-at-arms fighting as the front ranks of pikemen, as we've seen before, could resist missile fire definitely better, and tendentially, front ranks, as we've seen, were better armored for this purpose. There were still the clan's leaders, would be more easily casualty. So consider, again, the presence of firearms, not just arquebuses, but say, I don't know, multi-barrel guns and stuff like that. We're used to mostly, like as artillery would kept being used for a very long time, exploiting ricochet fire, not specifically in this case, but still like to mess up the front ranks, right? Yet, first of all, that was not much of a problem. Not it would remain, not it would become. I mean, on the longer time, because infantry still must use it, right? Artillery is technically the weaker arm of all. At least can't move, can't go anywhere. It's just limited in number. At best, it can defend itself very well, so it can still shoot in some way. But the capacity also of mitraille, etc., would evolve over time, and so you can't have it everywhere on the battlefield. In any case, having the nobility in the front ranks was also, first of all, a matter of pride, right? Of honor. These were necessarily the best men had to be in the first ranks. So here we see a case in which a man-at-arms would dismount to join the pikemen. This was and to be part of them. This was again becoming normal even in other armies to some degree. And if you have such good troops in the front ranks, well, still the entire formation benefits from it, right? It would immediately, it would serve the purpose, right, of strengthening the cohesion of the formation. You would have now the nobility fighting alongside their retinues, fundamentally their subjects, and this was also a matter of, say, they fight together with us, right? So it spirited them dramatically. So the nobility had all a physique, technical capacity, and also heavier armor on a regular basis to provide the pike blocks with a tougher outer crust, right? There is a source from this engagement saying, quote, "They were so well cased in armor that the arrows did them no harm, and were such large and stout men that one would not fall when 4 or 5 bills struck him." This is interesting, because bills were not meant just to pierce through armor, but they could smash quite potently, just shattering the body, the mind, whatever. So they are frightful weapons, and still, right, the capacity of this man to physically withstand that, but primarily from psychologically withstanding that, is something you find mostly among the nobility. They're sort of, say, above average people, but definitely, and this could intimidate troops that were good from the other side in the front ranks, but were not men at arms, dismounted, right? So this is an interesting way of seeing it. However, at Pikemen, the corpses of the Scottish noblemen and gentry could not be distinguished from those of commoners. Right, so at least by the mid 16th century, there was some lightening eventually of armor, to the point it may have even disappeared. At least it would have made the nobility blending into the rest of those who would normally also constitute the heavier ranks of the pikemen, even without them. So this is interesting, because the general impression is that the Scottish nobility was also less affluent than, say, the English one. So say, let's not stress the primitivism too much, but let's say it was possible, of course, that some of these men had more modest equipment. It would be somehow closer to the one of the others than at least others were. Right? Of course, after a battle, it was complicated to distinguish, let's say, the fallen from one another in many other ways. But this gives you an idea of the level of homogenization that this Renaissance warfare had somehow brought from previous times. We, interestingly enough, have the evidence of borders that normally fought as raiding light cavalry, dismounting, becoming pikemen in the process. This is the case of Flodden, for example, right? And in that instance, after defeating their initial opponents, the borderers were said to have taken no further interest in the battle and were later accused of collusion with their English counterparts to pilfer both sides' baggage. This wouldn't be so strange because lighter cavalry, this sort of frontier raiders, marauders that were made excellent. In fact, light cavalrymen would normally have the qualities needed to harass the enemy in many ways, skirmishing, carrying out guerrilla warfare, but also raiding, sacking, pillaging. These people stole cattle, not just to the enemy on the frontier, but on one another at home. So it's a bit like the earlier, the Ottomans used the Tartars and these lighter troops that were normally about that, laying waste the enemy country, providing even with the supplies for the army through loot, etc., but also looting themselves just for their own convenience, let's say, and so being quite dishonest, even abandoning the battle while they could have simply turned against the enemy, and instead thinking just to enrich themselves by, in this case, plundering not only the enemy camp but also their own. So this happened actually all the time. If you look at battles throughout all history, there is always somebody that carries out these actions. It's going in this way. But it's still interesting in this case, the capacity to mount and dismount, and even joining the pike squares, the pike columns, because evidently there were so many that you couldn't really quite go anywhere else, right? There was just a very few different types of troops that it was also not an alternative. Either you were these kind of essentially cavalry units, artillery numerically was negligible, or you were in these infantry units, and by standard that was what normally Scots went at war with, warlike, and surely the borders knew how to fight in many circumstances. So holding a pike or constituting other forces capable of advancing together with it, supporting it, it's all something they could do. Speaking of Flodden, opinions differ, as to whether the Scottish Highlanders were armed with pikes or fought in their, say, traditional medieval manner. Right. The sense is that, as we've seen, they were a bit more backwards, of course, and still at some point fighting with double-handed swords more than in the thickly packed formation. This is a bit of a stereotype. In any case, the front ranks were normally mailed gentry with long sword and bow, right? Those behind unarmored, and many only with a dirk. So they could be useful as, say, assault troops. Say if the enemy phalanx broke, you could harass the enemy. You could move, right? This was an advantage, evidently, of being faster than the, quite as we've seen, orderly cannons somehow. Paranoid not to break formation, pikemen. They had a role, right, in this conflict. There was a lot of individualistic ethos involved in this kind of conflict, because at home they fought like that, and they were often engaged in this terrible, feuds, and they knew definitely how to be spent in a more aggressive role. However, they were armed. They suffered badly from archery. This was a problem because at the end of the day, as we observed, let's say the pike columns can't, say, just have this front ranks that are objectively mostly the only ones that will get most of the hits, right? Because as we said before, yes, you could use even bows against, say, the rear ranks, but what you really cared about, because of the quality of the front ones, is taking out the ladder. So fire would be concentrated against them. They would absorb most of the fire. If you used the Highlanders as a sort of shock force that went out there on their own, naturally most of the enemy missile capacity were to destroy this very courageous, and not succeeding, by the way, front line of heavily armored pikemen. Well, against the Highlanders, it was somehow easier just to hit and strike. But also they were a more negligible target most of the time. Or at least they were less numerous than the Lowlanders, that were, as we've seen, mostly also more drilled, more updated, better armed, etc. So I would spend a few words for the influence that the Scots received abroad. We know, first of all, that, of course, especially aristocrats who wanted to see the world and still living in that adventurous way, also Highlanders, indeed, were hired by the Dutch, for example, from 1577, and together with English forces of the same kind, volunteering as pistoliers, right? So at that point in the art of war, meaning essentially, I can't say light. I mean, technically it's light cavalry, but they could take on an enemy also in hand-to-hand combat, cold steel. But they mostly specialize in this kind of running in front of the enemy ranks, unloading their pistols, and perhaps just at the end of the battle, charging the enemy pikemen if they were softened enough up to break. Because, as we were saying before, the pike was there since ever, right? And cavalry does charge into pikemen, right? And even is able to smash them. It just depends on how strong they are, right? And at this point in history, they're very strong, so much that cavalry has dramatically contracted and has to resort to this Reiter caracol type of tactics to do so. The Dutch are important because, besides, say, innovating substantially in their armies, at some point they depended on mercenaries. At first, they were all German Reiters and Landsknechts, Later, you find English and Scots equipped like the Dutch, right? Together with French Huguenots. It depends. We will see the Dutch army better. I made a video about the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War, so there's really a lot there already, but we will see things in a bit more specialized fashion with the infantry. The Dutch infantry of the time were mercenaries, fundamentally. The Dutch were eager to go at sea, but not to fight on land. But they created a very effective system, as you know. So the fact that the Scots were, by the way, equipped by the same Dutch, just like the English, etc., is fundamental because it tells you how, say, of course, we can't digress now on how they were hired and why, but how they were, say, conceived in the first place. There is not a just they needed manpower in many ways, not fighting styles necessarily. Of course, if you were a mercenary, you already knew how to fight in certain ways. It would be used in a specialized fashion when possible, but mostly we're talking about pike and shot troops, so an average guy in many ways. And you could have made a video about the background, the ethnic, moral, and cultural background of these early modern mercenaries, right? And definitely the Scots appear, because they were wilder, they were more brutal, right? More just inclined to that sense of, mostly because they were poorer, that they would have less to lose and more to gain in relative terms, to improve their lives, right? And we find, in fact, several regiments of Scots foot arriving in 1626-28 to Denmark during the 30 Years' War. At that point, they were immediately issued uniform by the Danish. This is interesting, for example. And I think in this case, they literally arrived as Scottish regiments, per se. So this is even a case in which, at least again, at this point, warfare was pretty standardized, so they would probably look like any other regiment out there. Just the Danish wanted to put their patch, their tag on it, and say, at least let's make them look as if they are at least within us. It was important, right? It was a way to also feel for the cause. There's a lot of psychological aspects in uniformation, historically. Scots were reclothed and armed as soon as possible after the arrival in Sweden, as well, at the time of Gustavus Adolphus. However, it would have not been strange, and we find here uploaded even here some print of that, and stereotypically, so the idea of some Scottish soldier in the Swedish army, the first half of the 17th century, still with kilts, even long bows. Right, this was an actual thing, right? These troops were employed firing while we've seen it in the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, etc. And again, from some of the most backwards areas of Europe, needing, right? It's a bit like, I don't know, the Welsh at the time of the 100 Years' War in English armies. Very far from being any better or worse than the English longbowmen, they simply were hungrier, right? That's why there are so many of them in those armies. Here, in the terrible confessional conflicts that tear Europe apart, you find lots of Scots, also Irish, etc. But I mean, in every country had their own mercenaries around, but the Scots, especially in Northern Europe, were pretty much out there. So we can make just brief observations about the pikemen of the Scottish Covenanters. So we're basically in the last decade of this period, like from 1639 to 1615. These were essentially the forces who had signed the National Covenant until the English conquest in 1652. They were originally Presbyterians against the interference of Charles I, and they essentially they were sent to intervene in the English Civil War in return for the English Parliament's promise to impose Presbyterianism on England. The promise was broken. It's a pretty complicated situation. They say a majority faction of the Scottish government, the so-called Engagers, made an identical agreement with the captive Charles I. So, despite the fact that the bitter opposition from the Kirk and its supporters, because most of this mess had happened due to, aside from what was happening, this is the phase of the Three Kingdoms wars, because they were all intertwined. They were, Charles I was the king of all here, but it was about taxing the church, right? And this implied naturally lots of problems in a country like Scotland, etc. In any case, the point I wanted to make is that Scots pikemen, here we are at the end of the period, bear it in mind, in Ireland, because they went fighting there as well, were defeated by the Irish pikemen. Why? Well, because apparently their own pikes were significantly shorter, meaning, as we said at the beginning, that it's not about the length of the pike, but say as a cause, but mostly as a consequence of the fact that their pikes, the Scottish pikes, had been shortened, because evidently they didn't have enough training to wield the longer ones, right? And so being an effective, cohesive, combatant force in that circumstance. In fact, these troops may have been an especially bad overseas purchase, right? But the reverses inflicted by Royalist cavalry at Marston Moor and by new model pikemen at Dunbar imply pike shortening was endemic in the Scottish forces. So we see it more systemically, and this is somehow telling of say the Scottish situation was definitely lagging behind at this point, not just the continent, but even the rest of Britain, in part even of Ireland, right? The Irish needed, still muskets at that point shipped from the Papal State, right? We will talk about Irish warfare during this time, because it's quite fun in this regard. But they also had emerging forces. I mean, as you know, they achieved very few throughout this time. Bamber, but exactly in this sense, like if those who had to be struck were the Scottish pikemen in that regard. And they, of course, it's not about the, again, pike lengths, etc. These battles were lost and won for different reasons. But it's still an indicator, right, that things were somehow going down for Scotland. And speaking of the Montrose Royalists, that, as you know, we're talking about 1644, 1647. Montrose was a marquis who initially joined the Covenanters in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, but subsequently he would support King Charles as the English Civil War developed. So from 1644 to 2 years later, and again in 1650, he fought in the Civil War in Scotland on behalf of the king. Paradoxically, so this is referred to as the Great Montrose, and he did lots of very interesting feats, mostly bold strategic maneuvers, eluding the blockade of an entire army by simply passing by in the darkness, etc. So there's a bit of a legend of Montrose, and our beautiful say even cultural references to this, like others later. Think about the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee and all that stuff. But we will see this in detail in another video, because it really deserves. In any case, the little detail here is that the Irish regulars on whom Montrose mainly depended as a sort of rebel force started with a few short pikes or none at all, right? So the Irish, as we were just saying, were not that thrillingly ahead compared to the Scots. They were, for this reason, initially very vulnerable to cavalry. Also, musketeers were inadequately supplied, especially of ammo, right? And this created some interesting interaction with the pikemen, because as soon as the volley was fired, then they had to immediately fall back on, accompanied by their pikemen. Complicated stories that show how, of course, complicated things are when you're out of resources. And consider, however, this aspect that is, as we've seen in the videos about the English Civil War, that in the infantry of the English Civil War, that that theater was already ahead in many ways in terms of the substitution of muskets to pikes to an important degree. This was true, like treatises still say reason in ideal terms with this, say, balanced proportions, but in many instances, even during the 30 Years' War, that was being fought at the same time, that probably pikes were an hindrance, right? They hampered maneuvers, marches especially, and as you know, especially the English Civil War is about a lot of country, and English countryside warfare, so a lot of hedges, a lot of, say, of obstacles that surely are not the best for pikes, and that would bring musket to be, enhanced. So you can imagine maybe in the Celtic French a bit more of this even, except with lower standards, generally speaking, in terms of army organization. Again, just essentially the new model army was the deal, right? Compared to royalist forces, were somehow still mixed and very often poor in material. They were really, say, even clubsmen, literally, fighting in this pike and shot, the ideally pike and shot reality. But that shows you also how, of course, war changes, right, in how it's carried out, aside from the fact that it's always the same in the essentials. And so you could think that at least this, even the fall in pike quality in Scotland is due to, in part, the failure of a state. I mean, let's be honest about this. Was a very archaic system by now that had failed to modernize. But also probably the recognition that it wasn't needed even to have something much better drilled, and that simply cost too much, right? At this point, when things were starting to be made by actual states, right, so that could field actual armies. I said something terribly modernistic for my anti-modernistic prejudice. There is much of this. I mean, if you look at costs, right, revenues of these countries, etc. So it would be interesting to keep talking about them. And in fact, I'm planning to talk a bit more about 16th, 17th century warfare, because we haven't covered that much, or at least not enough, never enough. But that's a bit our deal here. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.